That is as simple as I could make for a horse and a human. And we're going to make comparisons. Remember, this is an overview. This is Introduction to Animal Anatomy. We're not going to give every detail. We will go in for a full day, a full session on the hind leg to get the big important things of that. We're still going to simplify. You just got to simplify. Life's complex. Can't understand it unless we simplify. But right now we're going to simplify the whole thing. We're going to look at the whole body, the whole skeletal structure, and see if we want to get beyond just a side view of a square that a horse fits in and the neck comes out. What else is important? Well, we could say that with horses in particular, the halfway point is where the limbs are, if they're normal limbs, normal extended limbs and not all folded up, and the top half, all of the torso fits in that. Okay, we already kind of saw that point. We could say that the length of the head on a horse, well, that length, the height of this square, is about 2 and 2/3, or about 3 of those lengths. 2 and 2/3 is more typical. And of course, if that's the case, that means that the width of this thing, I make it a little shorter than the head I made up there, is about 2 and 2/3 or 3. Okay. And we could say that the size of the neck is at least the size of the head and usually bigger. So if we've got a few measurements that can break things down, we could say that the scapula is about the size of the head. We could say that the length of the pelvis is about the size of the head. You know, we could do this and memorize these things, but we will not. The reason we will not is because the specific proportions of a given animal will be different than the specific proportions of other animals, and there are so many different animals that if we do too much of that, we will get bogged down in it. And I have a recommendation to you about proportions. There is one great overarching secret of proportion, and it's not the one that you think I mentioned. The first one is simplify. The simplest shape you can get things into. A square, a rectangle, a square with a little box that sticks out of it, a square with a head length and another head length for a head. The simplest you can get will help you to master proportion. You get too complicated, you lose control over it. But there's another greater secret. The greater secret is choose an animal that you love and study it regularly. And if you do that for a period of weeks and months, you get to know its proportions thoroughly. You imprint them on your consciousness. And horses are a good start because they're so famous. There's so much documentation on horses. There's hardly an animal book around that doesn't take you through the proportions of horses. So it would be silly for me to spend too much time on it. But what I want you to see is what is important about studying a skeleton. Watch this. The torso chassis. The torso chassis is the most important thing to know first because it's all connected in a way that really is one single unit. You say, wait a second. You say it's one single unit, and yet, isn't that connected to it too? Yes, it is. You could include the pelvic block, but you don't want to include this, and you don't want to include this, and you don't want to include this. Why? Because those can move so independently of the entire torso chassis. You don't really want to include the shoulder blade. You don't want to include the humerus. You don't want to include the forearm. We'll go over what these are in a moment. Because those things can move without affecting the position of the torso. But when the torso moves, the torso chassis moves, everything is affected. So we start with this. And it's the same thing on a human, you know, although on a human we do include the pelvic block. Now, on a human, you can turn that side view into a 3/4 view, see? You can make a rib cage. And if I want to be looking down at that rib cage, no question I'm looking down if I run a rubber band around it. Let me move this down a little bit so I'll have room. And if I want this head to be looking in a different position than the rib cage, see, I say I want that head to be in this position, and I want to look up at the head, and the center line is going to be that way. I might want to move that head down just a little bit, maybe about there. And then when I want to put that pelvis into a position that is maybe facing more to my right, where I'd see this side over here. You see how that belly is going to twist? Well, it's going to be the same thing with animals. That if I have a great big something that is closer to me here and further away there, and a great big something that is closer to me over here and further away there, that could very well be a horse's head and upper torso and neck and rear end back there. And then when I have that established, I can put the other parts on it. But thinking big things first, and the chassis that includes, let's name the parts, the rib cage. Notice there's no ribs on this rib cage. That's because there don't need to be ribs on it when we're just trying to see the shape of it. The core of the spine, which we'll get to next week when we study the torso. The little doodads that stick up, we'll get to those next week in some detail. The vertebrae that are in there, the thoracic vertebrae, because the rib cage is called the thorax. The neck vertebrae, which we call the cervical vertebrae. The lower back vertebrae, which we have too, the lower back vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, and then our tail, which hooks in there like that. Their tail sticks out like that. But that's where we start when we look at a skeleton. The torso, next week, we'll spend one session on the torso. That's where we'll start. Now let's go to the next one, the next important things. The hind legs. We will study the hind legs after we study the torso. Notice something here. Our legs stick out. They are obviously upper legs. Well, horses and four-legged animals have upper legs too. Why do we not see them as such? Because on a horse, unlike on a person, that bone is buried inside there. That femur, which is the upper leg bone, is buried inside there. Most people think that this is a horse's upper leg and this is its lower leg. And of course, they're wrong. Can't see the horse's upper leg so well because unlike ours, it's buried inside there. Hey, there's something that goes on like that over here. This is the shoulder blade. Our shoulder blade is on our back. The reason our shoulder blade is on our back is because we do not run around on all four legs. See, our shoulder blade being on our back, can you see how, if we had a whole bunch of weight pushing down, this shoulder blade would not be in a good position. It could pop right off of there. But when you run around on your forelegs as well as your hind legs, and you've got all that weight coming down there. This shoulder blade, like a piece of tape that has better traction on this axis, you try to pull that piece of tape off that way, and it's going to be rough to pull it off. It's got better grip that way. So our shoulder blades, are on our back because we don't walk around on them, whereas the horse has shoulder blades on its side. And our upper arm, which sticks out from our body like so, the horse's upper arm, watch this, watch this, watch this. The horse's upper arm is also buried inside. People think that on a horse, this is the upper arm and this is the lower arm. Nope, that's not the way it works. The upper arm is buried in there. This is a forearm. This is a wrist. This is a hand. This is a finger knuckle. This is a phalanx. This is a fingernail. Now, that might not be new to most of you, but just in case it is, I'll let you give it a little thought. And just in case there's a question, I'll take your questions now, because I'm going to carry on with this to show you some more general comparisons. That was a general comparison. General comparison. Okay, let's move on. Let's compare limbs. I've color-coded these ones. I took this special time to color code these just for your viewing delight and to make things easy for you to understand. There's so much confusion in this world, so many difficulties in understanding things, but this in front of you clarifies reality. Enjoy it, ingest it, absorb it, rejoice. I made it so that the pelvis is magenta and the femur is purple and the lower leg bones are blue and the feet, that's a whole foot right there. Hey, that's a whole foot right there. You wouldn't know it, would you? I made it so that the hand is green. That's a whole hand and fingers right there. The forearm is blue. That's a forearm with an elbow right there, just like we have an elbow there. The upper arm is purple. That's an upper arm. And the scapula, our scapula is on the back, so we can't quite see it. We're going to talk about this next week, that little bump, the widest point on the pelvis, the widest point on the pelvis of a horse anyway. It's almost the widest point on our pelvis. That's called the iliac crest, the pelvic point, the anterior superior iliac spine. There's different names for it. But it's the pelvic point is good enough. But there's some comparisons. And I suppose if you want to take a screenshot of that, you've got access to it. That's yours to understand. Here's more. You see, the human, in this case, the human has his arm back and his shoulder blade on his back. He could reach forward and pull that shoulder blade a little bit more forward so that we could see what it looks like. Shoulder blades are complex on a human. Pretty simple on an animal. See, on a human, we've got a blade, and then we've got another thing called a spine, and that spine is a complex curve. Whereas on an animal, it's essentially a triangle with that same spine, which is a ridge. And if you wanted to draw it in 3/4 view, incidentally, I know I don't want to get too bogged down on this, but you see, there's a couple ways you could do this. You could think of it as a piece of French bread, and then you could carve out a plane like that. Using the French bread metaphor. But I thought of something that was convex first in order to get this thing to look like it's got a ridge on it. Sorry for my wobbly and terrible drawing, but I'm hoping that the point will be made through it. I've just never been good at drawing in Photoshop for style, but I've never been good at drawing for style in general, so it's not too much of a surprise. There's another way to do it. You could do that thing by making it a plate first. I'm going to make a little plate that's going to be like that, and then we would build a ridge out of it. Like so. But whether I start with something flat and build a ridge out of it, or start with something thick and carve out of it, is not that big a deal. The point is, this scapula on an animal is quite simple by comparison to the scapula on a human. Oh dear, I think I made so many marks, I'm not going to be able to erase them all. Let's see. Give me just a moment while I revert. Here we go. Shoulder blade, humerus, upper arm, lower arm, with an elbow, hey, an elbow, hey, an elbow, hey, an elbow. Every one of us has an elbow. Here's a toughie. Here's a toughie. When we look at our wrist, we can tell that's a wrist. We can tell that this is a wrist on a cat. It's going to be a little bone there, a piece of foreign bone that's going to be real important about structuring our wrist. We'll see that in 2 weeks. Much harder for people to see this as a wrist. In fact, it moves so much like a knee that horse people call it the knee, even though that's the knee. See, our hands are more like cats, much less like horses. Let's look at the hind legs now. The hind legs, we've got a pelvis. We've got a complex pelvis because it helps us stand upright. Animals' pelvises are pretty much the same, but they tend to be flattened out. A bit simpler to understand, but there is one important thing about pelvises. We'll get to this more next week, but let me just mention it now. All animal pelvises, with no exceptions that I can think of, tilt this way. You say, no, the cow's goes up. Actually, the cow's tail goes up. The tail is part of the spine. Remember? Let's go back to see. The tail is an extension of the spine. And it is true that on a horse, it is true that on a cow, that sacrum will go up like that. But the pelvis itself will be at more of an angle, like you see on a horse. So here we go. We have a pelvis like that, a pelvis like that, whether it's big dog, big cat, little dog, horse, cow, or any other four-leggeter. And I think I have one more. No, two more. There we are, just the shoulder blades. and the pelvis is isolated, and just the hands and the feet isolated. Really useful. We know feet from the time we're kids. Our parents sang us songs about them. Somebody sang songs to you about your feet. So you know there's a heel, you know there's an ankle, and you know there's the ball of the foot, and you know there's the toe, and you know that every single toe has a song about it and a voice to it. Pretty easy to see that on a cat, although that heel is up high in the air. Pretty hard for most people to know that that's a heel way up in the air. And how high is it? Hey, look at the length of the head. The length of the head is about the height of the heel to the ground. It's pretty high up there. Oh, let's see. There it is. If that's going to help you, I hope it will. Remember what we're doing. We're doing overview. We're doing big parts. We're doing things that see if we can get that. There we go. Sorry. Things that we will take up in detail later. All right. You ever seen the routine between Dudley Moore and Peter Cook of the One-Legged Tarzan? Well, I don't have time to recite it for you, but it's worth it. It's worth the time. It's just that we have work to do, you know. No time for silliness. Okay, any questions about this? Because I'm going to make one more point about bones, and then we're going to look at some lessons about muscles. One more point about bones that's a toughie. Looks like you're all relaxed, enjoying it. Yeah, so glad.
There are a couple questions. I don't know if you can see them in the chat.
Let's see. I'm seeing all sorts of things in the chat. I'm trying to find which. How long did it take to Marshall draw the analytical bull? I answered that one.
Okay, that's a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, here's what we'll do. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Is it Maynes? M-A-Y-N-S Larson? Maynes Larson? Can we get a? Let's see. I've got to get up here. We're out of Photoshop. You know, all of my images that I'm putting up here, you can screen capture. When I show somebody else's images, it's not legal for you to screen capture. Everybody does it anyway. But with mine, feel free to screen capture these. If you ever show them, if you post them on your website or anything, credit me. I don't have my name on all of them because I just haven't been that conscientious about it. But I don't want somebody else to take them and profit from them, or I don't get anything from them. But if you're sharing it with, you know, on your blog or with your friends, or if you're just, you know, using it and credit me, then I'm fine with it. These things are out there. Everything's so easy to steal these days that we might as well just give it away when it's something like this. But I will do something for those of you who are concerned about, for example, is it mine saying, but aren't we going to cover comparative anatomy? The answer is yes. We're going to cover comparative anatomy in the simplest terms we can. But Mines, do you see that comparative anatomy could be 2 or 3 years of intense study and you'd never exhaust it? So the way to study comparative anatomy is generally, and then here's the thing that you can't steal. Here's the thing that is unique to this class. If you are working on a particular animal, if there's something that you're involved with, I think we might have one session that's feedback day, where you say, Marshall, I've taken your class and I've got trouble. Your class is not answering this issue. Help me here and answer this issue. And then if you're posting stuff and then I'm giving it feedback, then instead of saying we will now compare 2,000 different animals or even 20 different animals, which we don't have time to do and wouldn't be that useful, frankly. But if you say, I am doing a mythological creature, this thing's half monkey, this thing's half horse, and it's half human, and I want to know how the human belly, the rectus abdominis of the pelvis, and the horse's rib cage that has that sternum on there that's like a keel, I want to know what would be, how would you work these muscles? Those are things we could get to, right? Those are things that would be unique to our little group. Now, Mines or Maines, I still haven't heard how to pronounce your name. Maines? It's a hard one. Maines. When I see those 3 A's with those little dots on it, you've got to remember, I'm a guy who was raised in Anaheim, California. I have never been out of Southern California, much to speak of, and I'm not used to seeing those little dots over the letter A. I don't know how that pronounces it. So let's hear you say it. Mons. It's beautiful. Mons. Did that sort of answer your question? I wondered what, oh, I guess you've answered it. Just, yeah, okay.